We are here to ensure peace and stability, working together for a brighter future for all our people.
The air was dry, the tension suffocating. A sandstorm loomed in the distance, as if summoned by the gravity of what had just landed on the president's desk. The camera pans across the presidential war room, not opulent, but armored in resolve. At the center, under a flickering fluorescent light, a plain manila folder sealed with a red wire clasp. No return address, no cover letter, only a black stamp. Strictly confidential, eyes only. President Ibrahim Traoré tore the seal himself. Inside, a 3-paragraph cable, unsigned but unmistakable in tone. The final sentence struck like a gunshot through the room's silence. You have 48 hours to deliver 60% of your national oil and gold reserves, or face the consequences. The name at the bottom wasn't inked for diplomacy. It was etched like a brand. Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. No salutation, no justification, just a demand and a deadline. The cable had bypassed all traditional channels. No State Department notice, no IMF procedure. It was hand-delivered by a former American military attaché, escorted by 2 private security contractors, the kind whose records don't appear in government databases. They left as quickly as they arrived, offering no explanations. Only a single phrase muttered in passing. Do the right thing or you won't get a second chance. Was this still international diplomacy, or had the rules changed? This wasn't a policy request. It was asset seizure in a velvet envelope. A sovereign state treated like a resource depot. The gold mines of Essakane, the new oil block near Gawa. All of it 60% demanded, like tribute to an empire that hadn't officially declared war. But who needs war when you control debt, sanctions, and shock diplomacy? In Washington, they called it strategic leverage. In Ouagadougou, it sounded like extortion. And in the middle stood a man raised in the barracks, not boardrooms, a captain, not a CEO. Ibrahim Traoré stared down the cable, then looked up at his ministers and generals. Not a word was spoken. But everyone knew the next move would make history or erase him from it. How does a small, landlocked nation stand against the full weight of a global superpower? What happens when you say no to the most powerful man on Earth? The answer would shake the entire continent. The camera cuts through haze and heat, a dry wind pushing against the rusted flagpoles outside Burkina Faso's modest presidential compound. Inside, no marble floors or velvet curtains. Just concrete walls, bulletproof glass, and a long rectangular table surrounded by men who have buried too many friends to smile in meetings. A single sheet of paper lies in the center of the table, not folded, not formal, typed in all caps, with the authority of an empire long used to obedience. We saved you from terrorism. Now it's time to pay. Signed, Donald J. Trump. Stamped, Executive Action, Urgent Compliance Required. The demand? 60% of Burkina Faso's oil and gold, not in partnership, in transfer, within 48 hours. For any small nation, that would be a death sentence hidden in polite threat. For a country clawing back sovereignty after a century of extraction, it was a deliberate humiliation and a test of submission. Traoré didn't flinch. He read the cable aloud once, then again, slowly, then folded it in half and set it down like a used napkin. His eyes didn't leave the page as he spoke. Tell the Americans, Burkina Faso is not for sale. The intelligence chief leaned in, stunned. The military commander raised a brow. This wasn't just refusal. It was defiance in the face of calculated pressure, a message meant to be heard not just in Washington, but in every capital that assumed African silence was a given. And it echoed across the Sahel, across West Africa, across the continent. From the markets of Lagos to the ministries of Kinshasa, from student halls in Dakar to radio stations in Windhoek, the headline flashed like a spark. Traoré says number. No to intimidation. No to plunder disguised as aid. No to backroom diplomacy cloaked in economic blackmail. But what kind of leader risks everything, trade, stability, even personal safety just to uphold a principle? And more dangerously, what if he's not alone? Is this the moment Africa stops obeying orders it never agreed to? or the start of something bigger, louder, irreversible? The lens cuts through the bushy savanna red dust in the air, armored trucks idling at the edge of a restricted zone in Gawa. Uniformed men from Burkina Faso's National Gendarmerie stand guard, rifles across their chests, flanked by a banner that reads, Zone stratégique sous contrôle de l'État. Behind them, silent and colossal, stands a newly drilled oil rig, no corporate logos, no foreign engineers, only Burkinabe. Few outside the region knew the truth, but inside the war rooms of global capitals, alarms were already flashing red. The discovery wasn't accidental. Russian seismic scanners, Iranian petroleum experts, North Korean tunneling technicians, quiet collaboration that mapped what France never mentioned and the IMF never funded. Beneath Burkina Faso's soil lay a vast reserve of untapped oil, and the world wasn't supposed to know. But it didn't stop there. At the same time, President Ibrahim Traoré launched a silent offensive of his own, not with tanks, but with paperwork. Presidential Decree 027/25, full nationalization of artisanal and industrial gold mining zones under sovereign control. Within weeks, French mining firms were expelled, contracts revoked, armed forces deployed to secure extraction sites from Gourma to Pora. The gold was no longer listed on foreign stock exchanges, it was flowing into a new domestic development fund held at the Central Bank of West African States. No press release, no G7 roundtable, just facts on the ground. And Washington noticed. The CIA sent reports warning of a geo-economic insurgency. US diplomats labeled it a model of anti-Western resource nationalism. Think tanks feared a domino effect Mali could copy. Niger was already asking questions. Ghana's opposition started quoting Traoré in parliament. Because if a landlocked, sanctioned nation could secure its oil with Russia, mine its gold without Paris, and fund public housing without the IMF, what excuse would the others have? The secret was never the oil. It was who controlled it. The danger was never the gold. It was who decided where it went. What happens when the poorest nations stop exporting their wealth and start weaponizing it for sovereignty? And more importantly, who gets nervous when Africa no longer asks for permission? The folder wasn't thick, but it was heavy, politically, legally, historically. 7 pages, no preamble, no pleasantries, just a classified US memorandum stamped in 3 places. Strategic priority, urgent, eyes only. It didn't come through an embassy. It was hand-delivered through a third-party logistics firm, backed by private defense contractors, the kind that doesn't show up on official manifests. Page 1. Burkina Faso shall allocate 60% of its current and future petroleum output to the United States at fixed, privileged rates. Page 2. All gold export routes must remain open to American partners. No new export permits to be issued without US review. Page 3. A US-led joint advisory board will oversee all extractive contract frameworks. Page 6. In exchange, the United States shall guarantee protection of the current administration against coups or instability. The language was polished, the message was not. This wasn't trade, it was leverage dressed in legalese, a new age of coercion not with soldiers, but with signatures. The fine print was clear: submit or face destabilization. Washington didn't need to fire a shot. It drafted an ultimatum, wrapped it in the illusion of partnership, and assumed silence from a country that, just a few years ago, couldn't even fully control its own borders. But the world had changed. And so had Ouagadougou. This wasn't 1960. This wasn't a colony. This was a sovereign state, with scars, memory, and now, teeth. Inside the State Palace, President Ibrahim Traoré read every line, not once, but 3 times. He marked the section on protection from regime change with a red pen. His voice, calm but laced with steel, cut through the room. So we're being offered immunity if we surrender control of our future? His ministers didn't respond. They didn't need to. The air had shifted. This was not diplomacy. It was extraction by legal decree imperialism, rebranded. They called it a partnership. But who drafts a partnership where only one side decides, owns, and controls? And if this is how the world's most powerful democracy negotiates with the poorest nations, what does that say about the system we've all been told to believe in? How many more contracts like this exist hidden, enforced, normalized? And how many leaders have already signed in silence? The screen cut to black, then static, then silence. And suddenly, across every television in Burkina Faso, the president appeared. Not from a podium, not flanked by diplomats or generals. He stood alone, no flag, no script, just a plain wooden desk, a worn leather folder, and a pair of eyes that had seen too much to blink. He held the cable in his hand, the infamous 7-page demand, 60% of the country's oil to be handed to American control, gold exports routed through US-approved corridors, and foreign contractors embedded in every resource decision. In return, stability and protection from regime change. Traore read it twice. Then he looked directly into the camera. "This is peace?" he asked, voice low but trembling with defiance. Peace, dressed like slavery in a suit. The line hung in the air like a verdict. And then came the orders. He signed the executive orders live on air: immediate lockdown of oil fields, military protection of gold mining zones, digital firewall around all foreign contractor access, communications to multinationals were severed, export systems shut down, every asset under national control, pending review. And then came the words that set the continent on fire. Burkina Faso is not Libya. We are not Iraq. We will not sell our land, and we will not sell our dignity. You have 48 hours to leave Africa. No translation needed. The message was unmistakable. Within minutes, the clip went viral. From newsrooms in Accra to cafes in Kigali, from student dorms in Nairobi to radio shacks in Bamako, his voice echoed like thunder rolling through dry savannah. It wasn't just a speech, it was a declaration of resistance. A continent once fractured by fear, now pulsed with quiet adrenaline. Could one voice reignite the will of many? Was this just the spark, or the first strike in a wider rebellion? And deeper still, what does it say about our world when telling the truth on live television becomes the boldest act of war? The sky over Ouagadougou was still unnaturally still. No helicopters, no cargo planes. Just heat and silence, broken only by the low hum of government-issued radios and the rhythmic beat of boots on sun-baked pavement. But in the courtyard of the presidential palace, something extraordinary was unfolding. 4 military convoys pulled in, license plates from Mali, Niger, and Guinea, not unannounced, but unexpected. Their presence didn't signal war, but neither did it mean peace. From the back of each vehicle stepped leaders uniformed, unsmiling, unshaken, no press, no protocol, just one shared message whispered between states, now spoken aloud before cameras and microphones. Touch Burkina Faso, and you touch us all. In that moment, a new doctrine was born. No treaties signed, no official communiques released, but every analyst watching knew what it meant: the Sahel Shield. A collective defense pact forged not in New York, not in Brussels, but in the dirt, fire, and fatigue of the Sahel. Africa, fragmented by centuries of borders and betrayal, had just drawn a line that no superpower expected, and fewer still dared to cross. Inside the meeting chamber, maps were unfurled, satellite images spread across the table, military corridors, pipeline choke points, defense perimeters around gold mines and oil wells. But more than strategy, what filled the room was clarity. The era of individual survival was over. This was continental resistance. And the world noticed. China responded first. Within hours, engineers were deployed to begin the construction of a fully sovereign oil refinery in Bobo Dioulasso, with a 90-day completion deadline. Simultaneously, Beijing proposed a new valuation system for Burkina Faso's gold outside the dollar, pegged to rare earth-backed indices, with settlement in digital yuan. Russia, never far from a geopolitical pivot, followed quickly. Electronic warfare equipment, satellite jamming tech, and minefield defense systems were shipped discreetly through Niamey. Their destination, the oil fields under direct threat of foreign seizure. Kremlin advisors called it technical aid, Washington called it escalation. But to Traoré and his allies, it was insurance against regime change, resource looting, and the silent weapons of modern imperialism, contracts, clauses, and conditionality. This was not a return to the Cold War. This was something entirely new, a Pan-African firewall, backed not by ideology, but by lived experience of coups funded from abroad, of agreements written in Paris, of debts calculated in English but paid for in blood. For once, Africa wasn't being consulted, it was acting. But the real question still lingered, whispered in think tanks and war rooms from Washington to Brussels. If Burkina Faso can trigger this level of solidarity, what happens when 5 more nations join? What if the continent stops negotiating and starts coordinating? And what if Africa, finally, stops asking for permission? The ink had barely dried on the parliamentary decree. With unanimous backing from the National Assembly, Burkina Faso passed a landmark resolution. All oil and gold reserves shall henceforth be owned solely by the Burkinabe people. Foreign ownership, operation, or leasing of resource infrastructure, permanently banned. No exceptions, no back doors. It wasn't just legislation, it was a line in the sand. Within hours, President Ibrahim Traoré appeared live on national television. No military uniform, no teleprompter, no entourage. Just a simple woven boo-boo in the colors of the land, and the voice of a man who had nothing to sell and nothing left to fear. "We are not afraid," he declared calmly. "And I will not negotiate with thieves." The room fell silent, but the streets erupted. Crowds poured into Ouagadougou's main boulevard, not in protest, but in celebration. Drums, chants, flags, children on shoulders, vendors handing out water and roasted corn. The message was clear. This wasn't politics, this was vindication. From Kaya to Bobo Dioulasso, the phrase echoed like a drumbeat. He said no. Not to aid, not to trade, but to coercion masquerading as diplomacy. Across the ocean, former President Donald Trump fired back in frustration. His message, posted on Truth Social, read, "Traoré just made the biggest mistake of his life. Africa will pay." But it was already too late. Because at that very moment, a 43-second clip of Traoré's televised speech had gone viral. In it, he speaks not to journalists, but to farmers, to mothers, to miners. His voice steady, his eyes burning with conviction. "This is the soul of Africa," he says. "And I would rather die standing than live on my knees." That clip crossed borders before any jet could. It was broadcast in Lagos classrooms, played on Nairobi buses, whispered in market stalls in Cotonou, not as propaganda but as promise. A continent that once whispered resistance in private was now repeating it out loud, in public, in unison. This wasn't just a political act, it was cultural, philosophical, and irreversible. Because nationalization wasn't just about gold and oil, it was about ownership of destiny. And in a world increasingly shaped by unseen contracts and hidden clauses, Burkina Faso had dared to say, "Enough." Now the question belongs to all of us. If the smallest among us can stand tall, what excuse do the rest of us have to remain bowed? This is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of a new page. So if you believe in sovereignty, in justice, and in dignity, save this video, share it, comment below. Because history doesn't just happen, sometimes we get to write it.